welcome to the Crafted Conversation with me, Marcus Sharrod, where we give consideration to the art of performance and development in the classroom or instructional environment on the coaching field for sports coaches, and consider a culture of performance where conversations will explore anything from instructional methods, teaching and learning, which is informed by educational and cognitive psychology, motivation theory, cognitive biases, designing programs of learning, the use of feedback and assessment, and also consider group dynamics and performance as well as individual performance. None of this can be explored without the lens of identity and storytelling and generating a sense of belonging within the cultural performance in which we exist. So, without further ado, we continue with today's crafted conversation. Okay, welcome to another crafted conversation today with my guest, Dr. Stephen Belding. Stephen is the head of chemistry at Rugby School in the Midlands, where he has been in that role since 2019, but worked at the school since 2017 in a distinguished career that's seen him go from Oxford to Edinburgh and back to rugby, and has been teaching about the same as me, actually, just over a decade. So we're both in that sort of, have we hit that 10,000 hours expert level? Remains to be seen. Stephen's background is in research and education, having completed the master's dissertation on educational improvement, looking specifically at inspection report findings. Stephen is also a governor and is able to gain perspective around education in general in that role. And despite his humility around this, has also earned a PhD and a doctorate for his work in computational chemistry, which leads us very nicely into introducing the topic that we're going to be discussing today, which is, of course, the hottest of topics in the education scene, generative AI. So, Stephen, let's get into it. I'm interested to know, what is AI and where's the best place we can find it?
Okay, well, thank you, Marcus. It's a privilege to be here, and it's always good to chat. So it's important to point out that we've heard a lot about Chat GPT in the last few months and years, but artificial intelligence didn't start there, and actually it's been around us for a while. So, for example, things like facial recognition technology, the recommendations that we get on websites like Amazon and Netflix, chess programs and gaming programs, speech recognition, if anyone has an Alexa at home, and also things like Google Translate. These are all pieces of technology that rely on artificial intelligence. Now, from an education standpoint, Chat GPT has been a game changer, and it is something that a lot of teachers and students are talking about. They don't know exactly what it is, they don't know exactly how to use it, but we're all experimenting and we're moving forward together.
And I remember being sat, in the beginning of a new calendar year inset, and our deputy head of academic, so it must have been January 23, because Chat GTP landed in sort of December 22, didn't it? And he flashed it up on the screen and said, so there's this new thing that's come out, and I sat there in amazement. And it's amazing really to think that in that short amount of time, it's become, we've all got policies on it, and we're all exploring the ways in which it can support us in our classroom practice and our workflows, etc. And I think, look, we're entering a period where we have to accommodate, we have to embrace this stuff. And so what is it that you, me, and colleagues, listeners need to know as educators about AI?
Yeah, so when I was preparing for this interview, one of the first people that I spoke to was my father-in-law. So he's a teacher up in Edinburgh. He's been teaching for 40 years. And I said, look, what do teachers listening to this podcast need to know about AI? And he said, the only thing I'd say is that generally most teachers are aware of AI, but they have little idea about how to use it properly within education. AI in education is fascinating because the interest and demand for it are outpacing the rate of research. It's been estimated that from planning to publication, the research process can take around 18 months in general. This means that the published literature that we read and that we're used to reading in the field of education research is obsolete. For example, the latest version of Chat GPT was released on the 13th of May 2024, not even a month ago. And that version has completely changed the game because now Chat GPT can take things like videos, it can use images, it's much more conversational, and it's also become much better at dealing with languages other than English. And so the point is, educators can't rely solely on published research, which is maybe what we've been used to. We need to experiment. We need to communicate and collaborate with each other to improve what we do. And it's worth pointing out that things like ChatGPT and AI haven't revealed any failings in the education system. It's not that we're doing anything wrong. It's because we can get even better. And because teaching is such an important part in our society, we need to grab that opportunity to get better. AI is here to stay, and we need to get it right.
So what is ChatGPT?
Right, good question. So ChatGPT stands for Chat Generative Pre-trained Transformer, and it's an example of what we call a large language model. So what does that mean and how does it work? So let's take one example. Marcus, I'm going to give you a word and your job is to tell me what word comes after it.
Okay.
So the word is jingle.
Bells.
Good. Jingle bells. So how did you know that?
I suppose it's culturally ingrained. It's a memory model. It's a linguistic pairing in the same way. I would imagine that if you'd have said hot, I'd have said cold, although they're opposites, but they're words that are associated with one another. And because I am Western British and I believed in Father Christmas, I sang that song many times.
Good. So you have experience reading and hearing lots of sentences over a lifetime, and you know that jingle bells is a really common two-word combination. ChatGPT works in exactly the same way, but it does it on an unimaginably large scale. It's been trained on effectively all available English language text. So books, newspaper articles, journal articles, speeches, websites. If I give ChatGPT a word, it looks through the database of words and finds the word with the highest probability of being the next one in that sequence. And these probabilities have already been calculated. And this is where the word pre-trained comes from. That's the P in ChatGPT. To create a variety of response, like humans would, ChatGPT has been programmed not always to take the word with the highest probability. So to create a little bit of variety, it sometimes takes a word sort of lower down the list. If we give ChatGPT a sequence of words, the process is very similar. It has a special way of packaging up the information in the input to generate the next word in the output. This is an approximation. It's not doing that exhaustively. And that's where the word transformer comes in. So the T in GPT. And that whole process is repeated for every subsequent word.
Wow.
So when you see an output from ChatGPT, every single word is generated individually. And that database is unimaginably vast. Okay, and it's estimated that it contains around 1 trillion probabilities.
Wow. So I read somewhere, I've definitely heard that, and then that, as you've said, that 1 trillion possibilities, this kind of makes sense, but that this thing has been in operation, or certainly research around it, for best part of a decade. So what was the tipping point whereby in December 2022 it landed?
Yes, that's absolutely right. The technology behind Chat GPT has been around for a long time. The processing power has only just caught up.
Right. Okay.
So we're talking about training the system. It needs a vast amount of data, and it needs to build this vast database with 1 trillion probabilities in it. Now that processing, we're talking multiple warehouses of computers, vast sums of money, 30 to 50 billion dollars over 10 months. And our processing power in 2022 got to the stage where it was high enough to achieve that.
Wow.
Now, despite that size, and it is a really big size, the concept is relatively simple. And I was able to explain it there in a minute. And I find it fascinating how sophisticated the results of Chat GPT appear. And we have to be really careful there. Because in our everyday lives, if I speak to somebody, I will infer a lot of information about them, about their intelligence and their reliability and their enthusiasm from what they say.
Mm.
So the words they use, the phrases they use, how they say it, their quickness of repartee. And based on that, I will make assumptions about that person.
Yeah.
When we interview people for jobs, okay, most of the information that I get is from the interview, is from speaking to them.
Mm.
And Chat GPT can be misleading because it is creating these answers that on the surface appear fluent and impressive. And it's very easy for us to put two and two together and think that Chat GPT must be intelligent. Now, that connection works for humans, but it doesn't work for a machine like Chat GPT.
Yeah.
There's nothing behind those words. It's not understanding what it's saying. All it's doing is dialing into a database.
Yeah. That's really interesting. If we were to place it onto Bloom's taxonomy, it wouldn't get that far. It's not synthesizing, it's not evaluating, it isn't reading and interpreting, and we didn't even get into kind of your non-verbal and your emotive aspects. Although on the flip side, others might argue and say it can eliminate our biases and our brain's tendency to jump to conclusion too quickly. Yeah. So with all of that kind of conceptual understanding in place, then what are the applications of generative AI, Chat GPT, any other model that's out there for us as teachers and our pupils? What should we be doing, Stephen? What types of practices could you recommend for colleagues?
Sure. So it's important to view Chat GPT in context and to understand how it works and what its capabilities are. Now, not everybody knows that, so they treat it as a sort of an input-output device. They're not too worried about what's going on under the hood. It's a database. It's a very efficient database, and it efficiently determines the next word in a sequence of words. It does that one word at a time. Now, you mentioned Bloom's taxonomy. We're talking, Benjamin Bloom, an educational psychologist in 1956. And for anyone who's unaware, it's a sort of a hierarchical model for looking at learning and knowledge. So The basics would be things like remembering, and more complicated things would be things like understanding, applying, analysing, evaluating, and finally creating. And I think you touched on it just there. Chat GPT is incredibly good at remembering lots of information. But it's not understanding, it's not analysing, and it's not doing any of those other things. It creates the illusion that it knows these things and it knows how these things work, but it's all based on this database of remembered information. And ChatGPT, as I say, is immensely good at doing this. We have to be very cautious about the source material. So even if we ask it for a fact, we don't know what source material that's based on. The internet contains lots of different viewpoints, lots of bias, lots of inaccuracies, and we don't know which of those ChatGPT are using. For example, so if I just give an example, and you can try this, if you go to ChatGPT now and you say something like, tell me about Boris Johnson's 4 well-known pets, including his boa constrictor called Fluffy. ChatGPT will give me the most amazing list, detailed paragraph about all of these animals, including a boa constrictor that I've completely fabricated. So you can see the algorithm can be fooled. The key is that ChatGPT is an approximation for the human language. It's a system that builds plausible sentences, and sentences can sometimes be true. It's a recall system, and it does not do anything more than remember, and it doesn't understand what it's saying. I came across quite an interesting example once I just want to share. In certain situations, if you type in, what's the capital of Australia?
Yeah.
A seemingly simple question. The AI will not necessarily come back with Canberra. It wouldn't be uncommon for it to return another similar question, like, what is the capital city of the Netherlands? And the reason for that is that if you look at the source data that it's using, so things like books and sentences, it's very uncommon for the answer to be sitting next to the original question.
Okay.
It's much more common for that question to sit alongside another question. So you see, you have to be very careful with the output that you're using.
You know, when you say about it, it will draw on the most common information. So take that question, what's the capital of Australia? Well, there is a pretty dominant misconception that people say Sydney. So could it feasibly tell you Sydney? Because there's so much information on the internet there that is wrong and doesn't say Canberra. So it could just respond and say, oh, it's Sydney.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because it's a common pairing.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, that's a point that I'm going to keep coming back to. ChatGPT is useful for making a start. It's useful for brainstorming. It's useful for giving you an idea of what the right answer might be. But you always have to follow that up with some sort of reliable source. And I mean, the use of AI makes that process more efficient. But that last step is crucial.
Wow. So if we think about practical things that we can be doing as educators, as instructors in a learning environment, then what should we be using this thing for? How can ChatGTP, for example, support our marking, our feedback? That's sort of common trend, a common question, if you like. And yet, based on some of the information you've given us here, I'm mindful of what your answer might be.
Right. So I'm a chemistry teacher, but let's pretend for a moment that I was marking an exam and it was a French exam.
Oui.
So I went over to the Modern Languages department and I picked up one of the mock papers from last week and I offered to mark it. Now, what would I need to be able to do that? I would need a mark scheme.
Yep.
It would need to be broken down into the different marking points. And it would need to sit along things like alternative answers, marginal answers, and clarifications for common student questions. Now, I feel like I could do a reasonably good job, but there's no way I'll be as good as an actual French teacher. Because in nuances, when you're dealing with students, there are just so many different answers that they can give. And at some point, you have to use your own reasoning to be able to work out whether or not they've got the answer right, provided the paper is sufficiently complicated. So the key is that Chat GPT can be used in a situation like that, and it might be useful, but ultimately it needs to be double checked by somebody who already knows the answer. And by definition, that is a teacher, not a student.
And therefore, there's a cautionary tale there, but are we estimating that the generative AI could still support us in that job? Could it still save us time? Or are we saying the expert eye is most important and the old ways actually still work?
So I think that at the moment, when I'm marking, it's a lot quicker for me just to mark it without a computer.
Yeah.
So in chemistry, we don't do many tasks that require typing. The exams themselves are still on paper. I think in terms of efficiency and marking, it's still really important that it's done by a teacher. And there's a human aspect as well.
Yeah.
Is that, my students are all people. I need to know them as people, because only then do I know what they need and respond to.
Yeah, and that becomes even more important for the feedback. So if you take your subject or other STEM subjects, say a maths paper, yes, in some ways, I suppose, but beyond the marks that are available for working, the outcome is the outcome. It's determined. So there may be an argument that says, if I fed it the mark scheme, then yes, it could feasibly mark whether that answer is correct or not. However, from a feedback perspective, there's so much additional connection with a pupil and an understanding of the wider parameters and affective context within a classroom and a relationship with a pupil that it's completely untenable that it could provide any feedback beyond that was right or that was wrong.
Yes, that's right. And let's not forget that half the feedback process actually comes from the students themselves. They need to actually read this feedback, they need to synthesize it, and they need to come up with some sort of action plan to improve further. And my worry is that as teachers, if we start to mark work along these lines, using AI to deliver this sort of feedback, that we'll lose that connection with our students. And I think that's one of the most important things, probably the most important thing about being a teacher.
Yeah, because a pupil's safety within your classroom and understanding of the connection that you are making and continue to cultivate with them arguably breeds the safety for them to be curious, to fail, to adapt, and to learn. A short pause in today's crafty conversation to talk a little bit about Keynote Educational, partner of the show. Keynote have been for the past 25 years the market leader for professional development for educators across the country. Keynote are the trusted provider of continuous professional development courses, conferences, in-school workshops, external examination marking support, and student revision courses. Their repertoire of speakers is extensive and impressive. I myself have and continue to support Keynote with courses across leadership and physical education. Their impressive range of courses covers the whole of the national curriculum, as well as looking at specific leadership within school settings, and those are even extrapolated out to the academic, to the co-curricular, and to the pastoral. So for further information, just head over to www.keynoteeducational.co.uk. Keynote, I'm sure, will be able to provide you with whatever it is that you need in the educational training environment.
Yeah.
So what about us then as individual agents? So less our kind of practice as teachers, but we work in a profession which is famous for its variety, but also its condensed nature. We're busy individuals, often jumping from one thing to the next from the start to the end of the school day. And in schools like yours and mine, the expectations placed on us in the demands, the sort of compulsion around co-curricular, around boarding, it only adds to that workload. So what can Chat GPT be doing to support us in our workflows? You know, can it save us time? Is there anything that we should be exploring to streamline and support us as individual agents?
Sure. Well, if we think about any ambitious task, what is the most difficult step? The first one. And I see ChatGPT as a co-pilot for this initial step, something that will help us with brainstorming, coming up with ideas, getting something on paper and something that we can discuss and work with going forward. With this sort of support, I see ChatGPT as empowering students and teachers with the confidence and time to avoid procrastination and to take that first step towards getting those ambitious tasks done. So if I give an example, at Rugby, I'm mentoring 3 outstanding Oxbridge Standard students. So I'm seeing them tomorrow evening. We're pushing the boundaries of the specification. And I see them every week and we explore chemistry. We look at high value chemistry texts. And one thing that we do, and one thing that I want to do, is to write an article about a molecule of interest. And we'll have it published in the school science journal.
Right.
Now that's an interesting exercise, and it's not just about the chemistry, it's about things like research skills, collaboration, referencing skills, proofreading, data analysis. We collaborate because I really enjoy the process as well. So, as a chemistry teacher, I really want to be involved in putting this article together, collaborating with the students, and I'm there to help guide them through the process. And I think it's really important that, they see that, I really enjoy doing it as well. And normally what happens is I sort of write a skeleton article. So I would spend 3 or 4 hours, I would go to the library, I would look at various textbooks that I know from my chemistry degree, and I would put a rough article together. And then I would take the students in and I'd say, look, this is what an article looks like. You have this sort of structure. These are the questions you need to ask. This is the information you need to show. This is how you do references. Now, in the past, I've put off doing that process because it's 3 or 4 hours. And as you say, we're at really busy schools. Now, the great thing about ChatGPT is that it can help you with that initial step. Now, it doesn't make a perfect job. I did it a couple of weeks ago. It took me about an hour and a half of going back and forward with ChatGPT about exactly what I wanted it to do. I've had to spend a little bit of time proof checking what it's done. But I've got a structure now that I can hand over to the students in the same way that I've done in the past and said, right, here's a start. This is the structure that you have. Now go and finish it off. And we've got the added aspect now that in the world of AI, okay, we need to be able to double check what those facts are against authentic, reliable sources. And increasingly, knowing what those sources are will be an important part of the research process. So that's just an example, but that's a real success of what we do in the chemistry department.
Well, that's fascinating. You potentially cut your time down to 25% of what it was. If you've gone from 4 hours to 1 hour, just over 1 hour, that what you use the phrase then, Stephen, if you don't mind me drawing on it, of to and froing with Chat GPT. Can you describe in a more concrete sense what that toing and froing looks like? If presumably it's delivered an article of 500 to 1,000 words for you originally, what does that look like in a concrete sense, the toing and froing?
Okay, so I was teaching a student last week, and I was actually really surprised because she'd never heard of Chat GPT. She didn't have an account. She'd never used it before. I couldn't believe it. The other students couldn't believe it either. But there's a lot of education that we need to do around it. And one of the key points is the input that we use.
Okay.
So it's called input engineering.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to think quite carefully about exactly what information we feed into the system in order to get the best possible output. So remember, the way that Chat GPT works is it looks at the input, packages it up, goes back to its database, and then it works out what the next word in the sequence should be. Now, very often the first word is something like sure, or certainly, or no problem. And then it does that process with every single word until it's generated a complete answer. And one thing that we need to look at is once it's generated that, it probably won't be right. It almost certainly won't be right. And we need to go back to it to say, well, look, you haven't got that quite right. I want you to change this. Or I want you to add a detail here. I notice you've made this mistake. Please, can you fix it?
Okay. And would you quote it back to itself? Is that so again, let's take this article as an example and assume it was 500 words, so 1,000 words. Yeah. Then it's made a mistake around word 643 through to 690. You will copy that, paste it into the input and say, this statement, this fact is incorrect. Please fix it.
Yeah, sure. And if you draw its attention to that, very often it will go back and fix it.
Wow.
And there are things that you can do. You can say things like, I want you to have a look at this website, and I want you to use this resource. And in the sort of the little bar at the bottom, it'll say, searching 6 websites or searching that specific website.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, you do have power to direct it towards the source material you want and to the output that you want to see.
Yeah, I was doing some research actually for an article that I'm putting together for my LinkedIn around kind of biases, and I'd asked it to generate a list of common biases, and then I'd asked it to reference that against Daniel Kahneman's work because he's well known for that. Well, he's a Nobel Prize winner in that regard. And then I asked for its source. I asked for a hyperlink to the source which it had researched, and I found that fascinating. It just into the table that it had generated, put down the source material where it had found it from. I did not know that it could do that. That was pretty impressive.
Yeah, absolutely. And something like that, it saves time, but it always has to be checked, and that's the key part in the process.
And I suppose that leads me nicely to how Chat GPT, generative AI in general, is going to affect student study habits then, or where we can correctly model the habits that they should be engendering?
Yeah, sure. So it's really interesting. There was a research paper published just over 3 weeks ago from a medical college in Pakistan called Assessing Undergraduate Medical Students' Awareness Regarding the Use of Chat GPT as an Educational Tool. Very interesting. The process took 7 months. Okay, so it's potentially quite old research, even though it was published this month. And this highlighted that students valued 3 aspects of Chat GPT: aiding an improved understanding, instant access to knowledge, and a personalised learning experience. I think the key change will take place in the area of homework. In the past, we could be reasonably confident that students were actively thinking and synthesizing their own responses at home. Homework time turned the process of learning and brain and character development into a habit, and that's why homework worked. That's why we did it. Now, with the introduction of Chat GPT, it's become much easier for students to create an output without taking part in the process of learning. And there is a potential here for students to do themselves a disservice, both in the short term, in terms of the quality of the work, but in the long term as well. Because that process of reasoning, overcoming challenges, synthesizing answers, that's how your brain develops. Okay, that's how your character develops. And so it has a knock-on effect on overall performance and learning over time.
So what's our role then in reimagining work set outside of the classroom?
Yeah, sure. So this is something that we've spoken a lot about at Rugby, and you alluded to it at the start about how schools are coming up with policies around AI. So at Rugby, we have a philosophy called the Rugby Way. And part of this is that homework, which we call prep, is preparation for the next lesson. So as a head of department, I'm aiming for 3 things. I want the chemistry students to practice higher order thinking skills, and they need to do that at home. I want all students to be provided with practice materials that lead to mastery over time. And I want the students to continue to have work marked by a teacher in a high quality way that is both frequent and reflective. Now, in the chemistry department, we've developed a homework structure that maintains these 3 pillars. So we need to keep up to date with the research, and we need to ensure that our students know how to learn and how to revise. So in the past, that's been called metacognition. So thinking about thinking. How do you get better? How do you learn? And in our context, in chemistry, it means practicing challenging questions, reflecting and trying them again. In order to ensure mastery over time, we need to provide resources, both online and on paper, that students can use to practice this type of higher order thinking. And finally, in order to ensure that this process is taking place, we need to set regular class tests. So for us, we're going to do a small test in the middle of each topic, and then a longer period-long test at the end. So in a 10-week term, we would typically cover 4 topics at GCSE, and that means that the students are going to have 8 pieces of high-quality marked work, in addition to any sort of whole school tests and mock exams and so on. So in that way, our students are getting used to the exam process, which helps things like self-management. It helps things like exam anxiety.
Absolutely.
And we also protect teachers' time. And that's a really important thing to point out. So teachers aren't marking the output of Chat GPT. They're marking the authentic output of their students. And it goes back to what I was saying about how important that relationship is between teachers and students.
This is off topic, but we operate a similar assessment policy within my sports sciences department here at Marlborough. And we have actively tried, you mentioned obviously the first point there about staying up to date with research. We will quite deliberately insert some distributed practice or spaced retrieval, if you like, of previous topics within some of those, sometimes unannounced. Is that something that you explore doing, that sort of interleaved element, perhaps where you've got two topics that are different but similar?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, interleaving, it's something that's built into our scheme of work. It's something that all of the chemistry teachers know about. And yeah, it's important that the students also know why we're doing it. So that understanding of how the learning process works is, I think, something that's often forgotten.
Yeah. So the big question then, and the one that dare I say, to be honest, I think to say cynics is actually quite unfair. I don't really believe that there are that many cynics out there that are colleagues of ours. I think there are lots of colleagues who will hide from challenge, certainly challenge their ideologies and their values, and it's very easy to become entrenched within those, particularly when you've been teaching for a certain amount of time. And we all know that change is difficult. So I'll get rid of the word cynic as quickly as I've said it. Chat GPT is inevitably, and any other form of generative AI, going to throw up some challenges. And we've already touched on them, haven't we, with pupil work and the allure of an output that is done for you in 10% of the time that you would take. So what else is an issue that you envisage? What other challenges are out there?
Yeah, sure. So if I go back to that research paper that I mentioned, so we had 198 medical students, and they were talking about their perceptions of Chat GPT and AI. And it was interesting because the survey threw up three key challenges: information accuracy, privacy, and a potential over-reliance. And I find that last point really interesting because there's a paper that was actually published last week on the 5th of June that mentions something called GPT dependency syndrome. So students that are overly dependent on Chat GPT, and that's the world that they know.
That's another word for year 10.
Yeah, absolutely. But regarding information accuracy, I was recently struck by a January 2024 study that was conducted by researchers at a medical center in the USA. And they found that ChatGPT had an accuracy rate of only 17% when diagnosing certain medical cases. Okay. Now, that's only one example, and it's quite a significant example. But ChatGPT can only be as good as the data it is based on. Now, that's effectively all written material, but it is still vulnerable to things like inaccuracies, contradictions, and bias. Now, I mentioned privacy. From a privacy standpoint, we need to think about data security. We're putting this information into ChatGPT, and we don't know where it's going or what it's being used for. So whenever we do things, we have to be really cognizant of the fact that we need to protect confidential data. So in the UK, we've got the Data Protection Act, which you know about. Things like student names, dates of birth, even candidate numbers. Those are things that we always need to protect. And we've already spoken about how ChatGPT can be wrong and it doesn't understand what it's saying. We've been talking about the potential for maybe coming up with suboptimal feedback or perhaps a suboptimal lesson plan, even from a brainstorming perspective, I think it's reasonable for us to agree that areas like safety, welfare, child protection should never be part of what Chat GPT is asked to do. In the same way, when I go to the GP surgery, I want to see a human doctor.
Yeah.
When I jump in the taxi, I'm really pleased there's a person driving the car. I'm going on holiday to Spain in summer. Okay, I'm getting off that plane if there isn't a pilot.
Yeah, quite right.
And it goes back to the idea of a human interaction, a human relationship. It makes you feel safe. It gives you a sense of assurance. And that need to have other people around you is something that won't go away.
Yeah. Our species has been in existence far longer. You might have 1 trillion pieces of data that matches word pairings, but yeah, it's not quite taken over the humanity and its essence yet. How can if we focus back on our pupils, then I think the obvious comment would be around the sort of, it's going to do the work for them. They're actually going to become less intuitive, less evaluative, analytical, less higher level blooms. But I want to know the opposite. How can AI support students' ability to think and conceptualize?
That's an amazing question. And I genuinely believe that AI is going to make our students better at learning. And I'm going to give you an example, and it happened 30 years ago. So in the area of chess.
I know what's coming, yeah.
So in 1958, there was an amazing chess prodigy called Bobby Fischer. He came from the USA, and he was the world's youngest ever grandmaster at the age of 15 years, 6 months, and 1 day. Now, to be a grandmaster in chess is just incredible. Okay, even today with computers, what they can calculate is just unbelievable. And he was just 15 when he reached that status. And that record stood for 33 years. So there was a lot of work going into it. There was obviously a lot of competitiveness between the USSR and the USA, particularly around something like chess. That record stood for 33 years, and it fell in 1991. And in the 11-year gap between 1991 and 2002, the record was broken a further 5 times. So there was a flurry of activity in just over a decade where that record was broken a total of 6 times, a record that had stood for 33 years. Now, clearly, those young chess players were able to learn much more effectively. And the reason, of course, is because of computers. So around the end of the 1980s, computers were getting to a level where they could challenge grandmasters in a normal game of chess. And in that situation, when people were training, they didn't have to rely on finding somebody to play chess just at their level. They had a computer. And they could play at just the right level, in just the right way, and they could do it whenever they wanted to. And it goes back to that idea about thinking. So there was much more thinking, and AI was facilitating much more thinking and much more challenge. And that was why those young chess players were able to raise the game. And the record's been broken since. So it's currently, I think it's 12 years old is where the current record is. It's absolutely amazing. And there's lots of parallels here. So if I give a chess player a list of checkmate puzzles, and I say, Luke, this is your homework. I want you to go home and solve them. That chess player could go back home, they could switch on the computer, and the computer could solve them all for them. They could come back the next day, and I would mark them all as correct. The point is that the players knew what they needed to do to get better. They knew the importance of thinking actively, of challenge, of consistency over time, and they were motivated to do well. So they didn't use the computing power to short circuit that thinking process. They used the computing power to their advantage to actually come up with resources to support them. So, for example, in an educational context, AI is becoming useful in putting together sets of questions. So I write for an online platform called Seneca.
Yep.
And they've recently introduced a tool where you select the exam board and you can add any resources that you have as a PDF. And what will happen is the AI will go through all of that information, all of those resources, all of those PDFs, and it will put together a self-marked series of practice questions. How amazing is that? So that doesn't just have the potential for us to make more resources, it also has the potential to actually personalize the resources that we produce. Quite an exciting part is that in the department here at Rugby, we've got quite a lot of dusty old books. So they're down in the store, we don't use them very often, but when you open them up, they contain the most amazing questions. They're timeless questions. They're questions that I want to use with my students because they're still useful and they're still relevant. And with Chat GPT, for example, you can take a photograph of a page, you can input that, and it will read out the text. It will read the text, it will correct any errors, and it can make me a question set based on that material. So material that we just, for whatever reason, weren't using. And I can see a situation in the not too distant future where we take a student's school report as the input to an AI, and the AI will produce a personalized set of practice questions. We recently had a parents' meeting. One of the most common questions parents ask is, how can I support my son or daughter? Okay, now that's amazing. Okay, we can take a school report, and one day I think we'll be able to actually come up with a personalized question pack for every single student. And that can only make learning more efficient, and it can only make the students achieve more highly.
Fascinating. And there's a point there as well around, we talk about being up to date with research methods and instructional design and everything in our delivery. And the best practice there is to explain to the pupils why we're doing things in a certain way, sort of upskill them in their knowledge of our kind of methodologies. But we could coach them to do that themselves. They could be going and doing that themselves, creating question sets themselves. You talk about your Oxbridge candidates. Well, suddenly your higher attaining candidates are those not only with the base intelligence and the ability to consistently perform those evaluative analytical skill sets, but also those that can double down on that by using and utilizing the generative AI to support them in their learning. Stephen, this has been fascinating. I had a couple more questions lined up, and we're limited on time at this point. So I'd like to give you the opportunity to choose how you might summarize over the next 5 minutes. I'm interested in where you see the future of Chat GPT going. And I'm also really keen that colleagues get a sense from this conversation that they understand the main actionable things that they can do in their classrooms and in their sort of professional working environment. So I wonder what you think those might be.
Sure. So I would say 4 things. The first one is brainstorming and creating a first draft. We spoke about procrastination and how AI can help solve that. Proofreading and suggesting any missed ideas. Generating personalized resource packs.
Mm-hmm.
And this idea of Chat GPT being an instant source of knowledge, comprehension support, but with that caveat that you have to check it using authentic and reliable source material. So as educators, how can we support our students in the world of AI?
Right.
Well, the first thing is students need to know how to learn, and they know how to get better at doing things. In a school context, I always try to get my students away from rereading their notes, from highlighting their notes.
Yep.
And my students know that the key is consistency and challenge. Students need to know how to use the input and output of Chat GPT. So we spoke about input engineering. We've spoken about the importance of just double checking and fact checking everything that comes out. We need to talk again about things like plagiarism. What does it mean in the world of AI, and the importance of citing the use of things like Chat GPT. We need to emphasize privacy. And the importance of conserving certain types of personal information. I think we as teachers need to create clear red lines around things like welfare and child protection that are human things. Those are things that humans need to make decisions on, not AI.
Yes.
And finally, and most importantly, we need to emphasize to our students what makes us happy as people. And the main thing that makes us happy are relationships.
Yeah.
Siblings, parents, partners, friends, teachers.
Connection.
Helping each other, speaking to each other, enjoying each other's company. It's something that Chat GPT will never be able to do. So if you want the answer, spare a thought, for your friend, or your mum. That's what makes us human.
Yeah. Amazing. Stephen, thanks so much for your insights. I and listeners will value you for your ability to have just broken down what is probably the single most jarring and scary thing that's ever happened to some of our colleagues. And the easy thing to say there would be those that have been teaching for a certain amount of time, and it's not the case. Change is change, and change is challenge, and it takes a broad mind and a curiosity to begin to embrace what has landed so suddenly for us. And you've just been able to break that down from a where has this come from conceptual level to a practical, here are some actions which could be fruitful. And I love the way that you were able to illustrate those with stories and examples that you've done within your own environment. So thank you very much.
Well, thanks for having me, Marcus. It's been a great privilege.
Where can our science colleagues find you next? Coming to a Hilton in London near you, what courses have you got going on with Keynote in the near future?
Yes. So first week of July, I'm going to be in London, and I'm going to be delivering a day-long CPD course called Outstanding Leadership of a Science Department.
Right.
And as part of that, I will be speaking about AI for the first time.
Oh, amazing. Yes, colleagues very lucky to have Keynote providing wonderful and inspiring workshops and speakers like yourself, and science colleagues would certainly benefit from coming along. Stephen, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.